Brain differences between men and women. The topic of brain differences between men and women is both scientifically complex and socially charged, touching on questions of biology, identity, gender roles, and equality. At its core, the idea suggests that the male and female brains, on average, differ in structure, function, or both, and that these differences may contribute to variations in cognitive strengths, emotional processing, and behavioral tendencies. While some evidence supports the existence of average sex-based brain differences, the interpretation and implications of these findings remain deeply controversial, often entangled with cultural assumptions and ideological debates. From a biological standpoint, it is undisputed that male and female brains differ in certain measurable ways. For instance, men tend to have larger overall brain volume, even after accounting for body size, while women tend to have a higher percentage of gray matter relative to white matter. Structural imaging studies have identified regional differences as well. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory and spatial navigation, is sometimes found to be proportionally larger in women, whereas areas of the parietal lobe associated with spatial processing may be larger in men. Functional studies using fMRI have also found differences in how male and female brains activate during certain tasks, such as emotion recognition, language use, and spatial reasoning. However, these average differences are just that, averages, and the overlap between individual men and women is enormous. Most of the observed distinctions are subtle, and many scientists caution against overstating their significance. In fact, some research suggests that individual brains are mosaics of features that are not strictly male or female but rather unique combinations of traits. One influential study by neuroscientist Daphne Joel and colleagues found that most brains do not fit neatly into a binary model but instead display a mix of features traditionally associated with both sexes. This challenges the idea that there are two distinct, binary brain types corresponding to male and female. The controversy intensifies when attempts are made to link brain differences to psychological traits or abilities. Some researchers argue that sex-based brain differences may contribute to observed patterns in cognition and behavior, for example, men's greater representation in spatial or mathematical tasks, or women's tendency to excel in verbal and emotional domains. These claims, however, are fraught with difficulty. It is nearly impossible to disentangle biological differences from the powerful effects of socialization. From birth, boys and girls are treated differently in ways that can shape cognitive development and behavior, making it unclear whether differences seen in adulthood are innate or learned. Furthermore, cultural narratives about male and female brains often reflect and reinforce gender stereotypes. For instance, claims that women are naturally more empathetic or that men are hardwired to be more aggressive risk promoting rigid roles that limit individual expression. These narratives can also influence self-perception and behavior, a phenomenon known as stereotype threat, where people unconsciously conform to expectations associated with their gender. Another layer of complexity comes from the growing recognition that gender itself is not strictly binary. As awareness of transgender and non-binary identities increases, so too does the understanding that brain structure and gender identity do not always align in the ways once assumed. Studies of transgender individuals have shown that some aspects of brain anatomy or function may correspond more closely with their gender identity than with their sex assigned at birth, suggesting that the relationship between the brain and gender is far more nuanced than a simple male-female dichotomy. In light of this, many neuroscientists advocate for a more cautious and contextual approach. They emphasize that while biological sex can influence brain development, it is just one of many factors, alongside culture, experience, environment, and personal history, that shape the mind. Differences in the brain do not imply inferiority or superiority, they reflect diversity. Importantly, variation within each sex is typically greater than the average differences between sexes, making it inaccurate to generalize about abilities or behavior based solely on sex. In conclusion, while there are some scientifically documented differences between male and female brains, their significance is often overstated or misinterpreted. The brain is a plastic, adaptable organ that is shaped not only by genetics and hormones but also by experience, culture, and learning. Understanding sex-based brain differences requires nuance, skepticism of simplistic claims, and an awareness of the broader social context in which such research is conducted. Ultimately, this area of study should serve not to reinforce stereotypes or justify inequality, but to deepen our appreciation for the rich complexity of human diversity. IQ and race. The relationship between IQ and race has long been a controversial and highly sensitive topic in psychology, education, and the social sciences. It touches on complex intersections of biology, culture, history, and ideology, and any discussion must be approached with care and scientific integrity. IQ, or intelligence quotient, is a score derived from standardized tests designed to measure human intelligence. These tests aim to assess a range of cognitive abilities, including memory, reasoning, problem-solving, and verbal skills. Although IQ tests have been widely used in educational and psychological settings, their interpretation, particularly in relation to race, has been fraught with debate. Historically, some researchers claim to find average IQ score differences among racial or ethnic groups, with white populations in the United States scoring higher on average than Black or Hispanic populations, and East Asian populations often scoring even higher. These findings were seized upon in the mid-20th century by some to argue for racial hierarchies in intelligence, suggesting a genetic basis for the observed differences. However, the assumptions underlying such claims have been deeply challenged on both scientific and ethical grounds. One of the most significant criticisms is that IQ tests do not, and cannot, measure innate intelligence in a vacuum. Intelligence is shaped by a broad array of environmental factors, including socioeconomic status, educational opportunity, access to healthcare and nutrition, exposure to stress and trauma, and societal expectations. These factors are deeply influenced by historical and systemic inequalities, particularly in countries like the United States where the legacy of slavery, segregation, and ongoing discrimination has had profound effects on the lived experiences of different racial groups. Furthermore, IQ tests themselves are not culturally neutral. Despite attempts to create culture-fair or culture-free assessments, no test is entirely free from the cultural assumptions of the society in which it was developed. Language, problem-solving styles, and even familiarity with test-taking itself are all shaped by cultural experiences. As such, differences in average scores may reflect differences in cultural exposure and opportunity rather than inherent cognitive ability. Genetics does play a role in intelligence at the individual level. Research suggests that IQ has a heritable component. But this does not imply that group differences are genetic in origin. The fallacy lies in assuming that group-level statistical differences imply a biological cause, when in fact they can emerge entirely from environmental and social disparities. Modern behavioral genetics emphasizes the interplay between genes and environment, acknowledging that heritability is not fixed and can vary depending on context. For example, in environments of high inequality, genetic potential for intelligence may be suppressed due to poor education or health conditions. In addition, the very concept of race is not a biologically clear-cut construct. Genetic research has shown that variation within so-called racial groups is often greater than variation between them. Racial categories are social constructs with fluid and historically contingent definitions, making it scientifically unsound to draw sharp conclusions about innate differences across such categories. The most responsible and empirically supported view in contemporary psychology is that observed differences in average IQ scores among racial groups are best understood as consequences of environmental, cultural, and historical factors, not as reflections of intrinsic or immutable differences in intelligence. Leading scientific organizations, such as the American Psychological Association, have repeatedly cautioned against drawing genetic conclusions from group data, emphasizing the importance of addressing social inequalities that contribute to disparities in educational and cognitive outcomes. In sum, while IQ remains a useful, if limited, tool in assessing certain cognitive abilities, its use in making broad claims about race must be approached with extreme caution. Misinterpretations or misapplications of this data have historically fueled prejudice and harmful policies. A more accurate and just approach involves recognizing the complex, context-dependent nature of intelligence and working to dismantle the systemic barriers that influence cognitive development across all communities. Criminal profiling. Criminal profiling is a psychological technique used in criminal investigations to infer the characteristics, behavior patterns, and possible motivations of an unknown offender based on the details of a crime. Often dramatized in popular media, it seeks to bridge the gap between forensic evidence and the psychological makeup of the perpetrator. Although widely employed in high-profile cases and by law enforcement agencies around the world, criminal profiling remains a controversial practice within the psychological and scientific communities due to its theoretical ambiguity, methodological weaknesses, and inconsistent track record of success. The practice of criminal profiling, also known as behavioral profiling or criminal investigative analysis, involves analyzing crime scene evidence, victimology, and the nature of the offense to construct a psychological portrait of the suspect. Profilers may attempt to determine whether a criminal is organized or disorganized, impulsive or methodical, likely to re-offend, or suffering from a specific mental illness or personality disorder. In theory, this can help narrow down suspect pools, anticipate future actions, and guide interrogation strategies. Profiles may include details such as estimated age, occupation, social background, intelligence level, and even personal habits or childhood experiences. Historically, profiling gained prominence through the work of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s and 1980s, where agents like John Douglas and Robert Ressler attempted to categorize serial offenders based on patterns observed in previous cases. They interviewed imprisoned murderers and rapists to understand the psychological factors behind their crimes, leading to the development of typologies such as the organized/disorganized dichotomy. These frameworks became foundational to the modern practice of profiling and heavily influenced how law enforcement approaches complex cases. However, the scientific validity of criminal profiling has been heavily criticized. Unlike disciplines grounded in empirical data and replicable methods, profiling often relies on intuition, anecdotal evidence, and subjective interpretation. Numerous studies have found that experienced profilers are not consistently more accurate than non-experts or even laypeople when it comes to predicting characteristics of unknown offenders. The lack of standardized training, methodological rigor, and peer-reviewed evidence undermines its credibility as a scientifically reliable tool. Critics argue that it borders more on art than science, often operating on vague generalizations that can fit multiple individuals equally well. Another controversial aspect lies in the potential for bias and wrongful suspicion. A poorly constructed or overly generalized profile can lead investigators to focus on the wrong person while overlooking viable suspects. In several documented cases, reliance on a misleading profile delayed justice or contributed to wrongful arrests. Additionally, the human tendency to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm existing beliefs, known as confirmation bias, can make profiles seem more accurate in hindsight than they actually are in practice. Despite these limitations, criminal profiling has undeniable psychological appeal. It offers a way to impose order on chaotic, senseless acts of violence and gives investigators a framework to make sense of what may otherwise appear random. In high-pressure cases, even partial insights into a criminal's behavior, such as signs of escalation, ritualistic tendencies, or victim targeting, can provide valuable guidance. Some proponents argue that profiling is best used as a supplemental tool, not a definitive solution, and that its effectiveness depends largely on the skill, experience, and multidisciplinary knowledge of the profiler. In recent years, the field has evolved with the integration of more evidence-based practices such as geographic profiling, statistical analysis, and data mining. These methods aim to enhance objectivity and reduce subjectivity by grounding predictions in observable patterns and large datasets. At the same time, forensic psychology continues to explore how deeper understanding of psychopathology, trauma, and behavioral science can inform investigative techniques in more rigorous and ethical ways. Ultimately, criminal profiling exists in a tension between its practical utility and its scientific shortcomings. It represents both the promise and the peril of applying psychological insight to the pursuit of justice. While it can offer useful hypotheses and direct investigative attention, its limitations must be clearly understood to avoid over-reliance or misuse. As with many tools in criminal justice, its power lies not in its mystique, but in how responsibly and critically it is applied. Polygraph tests measure truthfulness. The belief that polygraph tests measure truthfulness is a long-standing yet highly controversial idea in psychology and criminal justice. Often referred to as lie detector tests, polygraphs are designed to monitor physiological indicators, such as heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and skin conductivity, while a subject answers a series of questions. The underlying assumption is that deceptive answers trigger measurable stress responses, which the polygraph examiner can interpret as signs of lying. This idea has been widely embraced in popular culture and employed in various settings, from criminal investigations to security clearances. However, despite its widespread use, the scientific validity of the polygraph as a tool for detecting lies remains deeply contested. The theoretical foundation of the polygraph rests on the premise that lying is inherently stressful and that the body involuntarily reacts to this internal tension. When someone lies, it is assumed they experience fear, guilt, or cognitive conflict, responses that manifest physiologically. During a polygraph examination, the subject is typically asked a mix of relevant questions, pertaining to the issue at hand, control questions, to establish a baseline, and irrelevant questions, to measure normal reactions. By comparing physiological responses across these question types, the examiner attempts to judge whether the subject is being deceptive. Supporters argue that when conducted properly by trained professionals, polygraph testing can be a useful investigative tool. In some cases, it has led to confessions, corroborated witness statements, or eliminated suspects. Proponents claim that polygraph results are accurate enough to be valuable in screening for criminal behavior, espionage, or high-security employment. They emphasize that the polygraph does not read minds or detect lies directly, but rather observe stress patterns that may correlate with deception. However, a growing body of psychological research casts serious doubt on the reliability and validity of polygraph tests. One of the central criticisms is that physiological responses measured by the polygraph are not exclusive to lying. Anxiety, fear, embarrassment, confusion, or even the pressure of being under suspicion can all produce the same bodily changes. An innocent person who is nervous about being falsely accused may show stronger physiological reactions than a seasoned liar who remains calm and composed. Conversely, individuals with certain personality traits, such as psychopaths, may be capable of lying without displaying noticeable stress responses, thus beating the test. Numerous studies and expert reviews, including those by the American Psychological Association and the National Academy of Sciences, have concluded that polygraph testing lacks sufficient scientific grounding to be considered a dependable measure of truthfulness. Accuracy rates vary widely, and results can be influenced by examiner bias, poorly constructed questions, or a subject's mental and physical state. The margin for error is significant, raising the risk of both false positives, labeling truthful individuals as deceptive, and false negatives, failing to detect lies. This unreliability has serious ethical and legal implications. In many jurisdictions, polygraph results are inadmissible in court due to concerns about their scientific credibility and potential to mislead jurors. Yet, paradoxically, polygraphs continue to be used in law enforcement, government agencies, and employment screenings, often with considerable consequences for the individuals involved. The mere act of failing a polygraph, regardless of actual guilt, can result in job denial, reputational damage, or increased suspicion in a criminal case. The controversy surrounding polygraph testing reflects a broader tension between the desire for objective truth in high-stakes situations and the limitations of current psychological and physiological methods. The allure of a machine that can uncover deception taps into a deep cultural yearning for certainty and justice. But this aspiration must be balanced with rigorous scientific skepticism and ethical caution. In conclusion, while polygraph tests may offer useful psychological leverage in some investigative contexts, they do not measure truthfulness in any direct or reliable sense. Their continued use rests more on tradition, institutional convenience, and psychological persuasion than on empirical evidence. As our understanding of human psychology deepens, reliance on polygraphs may eventually give way to more accurate and nuanced tools for assessing credibility, ones that recognize the complexity of both deception and human physiology. Placebo effects work even when people know. The idea that placebo effects can work even when people know they are taking a placebo challenges one of the most basic assumptions in medicine and psychology, that for a treatment to work, a person must believe it is real. Traditionally, placebo effects were thought to rely entirely on deception. The patient believes they are receiving an active treatment, and this belief alone triggers real physiological or psychological benefits. Yet, a growing body of research suggests that even when individuals are fully informed that they are taking an inert substance with no active ingredients, they may still experience significant improvements in symptoms. This phenomenon, known as the open-label placebo effect, is both surprising and controversial, as it upends long-standing notions about the role of belief and expectation in healing. At the heart of this idea is the paradox that an intervention known to be biologically inactive can still produce measurable effects. Studies in conditions such as irritable bowel syndrome, chronic pain, depression, and even fatigue have shown that patients who knowingly take placebo pills, while being told they contain no active medication, can still report symptom relief. In these experiments, participants are usually informed about the power of the mind-body connection and are explicitly told that placebos have been shown to help others through mechanisms such as conditioning, expectation, and the body's own natural healing responses. How this works is not yet fully understood, but several mechanisms have been proposed. One explanation is classical conditioning. Over time, individuals may have developed a learned association between the act of taking a pill and the experience of feeling better. Even if they consciously know the pill is inert, their body may still respond in a conditioned way. Another theory involves the power of ritual and context. The very act of participating in a structured medical intervention, seeing a doctor, following a routine, taking a pill at specific times, may itself trigger physiological responses such as the release of endorphins or immune modulation. These responses are not purely cognitive, they may be deeply ingrained in the nervous system. Expectation also plays a role, though in a more nuanced way than previously thought. While participants may not expect the placebo to work in the traditional sense, they may remain open to the possibility of improvement simply because they are told that open-label placebos have worked for others. This openness, combined with a sense of being cared for or doing something proactive about their symptoms, can create a psychological environment conducive to healing. Furthermore, the placebo effect is not just in the mind. Neuroimaging studies have shown that placebos can activate brain regions involved in pain modulation, emotion regulation, and reward processing. The controversial nature of this idea stems partly from its implications for medical ethics and practice. Traditionally, placebos have been viewed as requiring deception, which creates a moral dilemma. Is it acceptable to mislead a patient for their own benefit? Open-label placebos offer a way around this problem by demonstrating that honesty does not necessarily diminish therapeutic value. However, this raises new questions. If people can benefit from taking pills they know are inert, should doctors prescribe such placebos more often? Should insurance cover them? Does this reinforce a pill-based model of health, even when pills are unnecessary? Critics also question the robustness and generalizability of these findings. Many open-label placebo studies are small, limited to specific conditions, and vulnerable to biases like demand effects, where participants report improvement simply because they feel they're supposed to. Others worry that promoting placebos, even openly, risks blurring the line between science and pseudoscience, potentially encouraging unproven or alternative treatments under the guise of psychological benefit. Despite these concerns, the growing interest in open-label placebos reflects a broader shift in how we understand health and healing. Rather than viewing the mind and body as separate, many researchers now emphasize their deep interconnection. Placebo responses highlight the power of expectation, attention, trust, and meaning in shaping health outcomes. They suggest that the context of treatment, the relationship with the provider, the rituals of care, the narrative surrounding the illness, can be as important as the substance of the treatment itself. In conclusion, the idea that placebo effects can occur even when people are aware they are taking a placebo invites a re-evaluation of long-held assumptions in medicine and psychology. While still emerging and not without controversy, this concept underscores the profound influence of the mind on physical and emotional well-being. It opens the door to ethical, non-deceptive uses of placebo effects in clinical practice and points to a more holistic understanding of what it means to heal. Whether seen as a challenge to conventional models or an opportunity to harness the brain's natural capacities, the open-label placebo is a striking example of how belief, expectation, and care can shape human experience in ways that science is only beginning to fully comprehend. Video games cause violence. The idea that video games cause violence has sparked intense debate for decades, sitting at the intersection of psychology, media studies, public policy, and cultural fear. This belief gained widespread attention during the 1990s, particularly in the wake of high-profile violent incidents like school shootings, where perpetrators were sometimes reported to be avid video game players. Critics of violent video games argue that repeated exposure to virtual aggression desensitizes players, erodes empathy, and increases the likelihood of real-world violent behavior. On the other hand, a growing body of research and expert opinion challenges this claim, pointing out the lack of consistent evidence and emphasizing the importance of individual, social, and environmental factors. Proponents of the video games cause violence hypothesis often cite psychological theories such as social learning theory and the general aggression model. Social learning theory, proposed by Albert Bandura, suggests that people, especially children, learn behaviors by observing and imitating others, particularly when those behaviors appear to be rewarded. In violent video games, players often assume the role of characters who use aggression to solve problems, earn points, or progress through the game. According to this view, such repeated reinforcement of aggressive behavior might shape a player's attitudes or emotional responses in real life. Supporters also point to studies showing short-term increases in aggressive thoughts, arousal, or behavior after playing violent video games. Laboratory experiments, for example, have demonstrated that participants exposed to violent games may be more likely to respond aggressively in controlled tasks, such as assigning louder noise blasts to others or interpreting ambiguous actions as hostile. These findings are often interpreted as evidence that violent games can heighten aggressive tendencies, at least temporarily. However, critics argue that such studies have limited real-world relevance. Most laboratory measures of aggression are artificial, abstract, and detached from actual violence. Assigning noise blasts or filling in word fragments with aggressive terms does not equate to committing acts of physical harm. Moreover, many of these effects are small, short-lived, and heavily influenced by context. Long-term, large-scale studies often fail to show a strong or consistent link between video game violence and criminal or physically aggressive behavior. Some even suggest that, despite the exponential rise in video game popularity, youth violence has decreased over the same period, highlighting a mismatch between media narratives and actual crime trends. Another major concern is that focusing on video games as a cause of violence can distract from more significant contributing factors such as poverty, family dysfunction, mental illness, substance abuse, bullying, or access to firearms. Simplifying a complex societal issue by blaming video games risks moral panic rather than meaningful understanding. It also reinforces stereotypes and biases, particularly toward young males, who are the most frequent consumers of such games but not necessarily the most violent demographic. Psychologists and researchers increasingly emphasize the importance of individual differences in how media is consumed and processed. Not all players are equally affected by violent content. Personality traits, emotional stability, family environment, and prior trauma all influence how a person engages with video games. For some, playing violent games can be a form of stress relief or escapism with no harmful consequences. For others, particularly those already prone to aggression or emotional instability, it might serve as a trigger, but even in these cases, it is rarely the sole cause of real-world violence. Interestingly, some studies have found potential benefits to video game play, including improved cognitive skills, spatial reasoning, cooperation in multiplayer settings, and emotional resilience. Games can offer a sense of mastery, social connection, and even opportunities for moral reflection, depending on the content and context. The relationship between video games and human psychology is not inherently destructive, it is complex, diverse, and highly context-dependent. Ultimately, the claim that video games cause violence is not supported by conclusive scientific evidence. While violent games may influence certain thoughts or moods in the short term, there is no clear, direct, or causal link to serious violent behavior in the general population. The controversy persists, in part, because of cultural anxieties about technology, generational divides, and the human tendency to search for simple explanations for troubling social problems. Responsible media consumption, parental involvement, and thoughtful game design are all important, but blaming video games alone for acts of violence overlooks the deeper, multifaceted nature of human aggression. The role of free will. The role of free will in human thought and behavior is one of the most enduring and controversial issues in psychology and philosophy. At its core, the debate concerns whether individuals truly have control over their actions, choices, and intentions, or whether behavior is entirely determined by a combination of biology, environment, unconscious processes, and external forces beyond conscious awareness. Free will is often assumed in daily life, embedded in moral, legal, and cultural systems that hold people accountable for their actions. Yet from a scientific and psychological perspective, the reality is far more complex and uncertain. In classical philosophy, free will has often been tied to the notion of moral responsibility. If people are to be judged for their behavior, it seems necessary to believe they could have chosen otherwise. This assumption underlies systems of justice, education, and personal relationships. However, as psychology and neuroscience have advanced, many scholars have begun to challenge the idea that we are as free as we imagine ourselves to be. Freud's theory of the unconscious, for example, introduced the idea that much of what motivates us lies outside of conscious awareness. We may believe we are acting freely, but in truth, our behavior might be shaped by hidden desires, childhood experiences, or repressed emotions. Behaviorist psychology took this even further, arguing that all behavior is the result of conditioning. According to figures like B.F. Skinner, humans are not autonomous agents making independent choices, but rather organisms whose actions are shaped by reinforcement histories and environmental contingencies. In this view, the sense of agency is largely an illusion. People behave as they have been conditioned to, and their actions can be predicted and controlled given sufficient knowledge of past stimuli and consequences. Cognitive psychology offered some correction to this determinism by reintroducing internal mental processes, beliefs, goals, and intentions, as factors in behavior. But even here, the extent of conscious control is debated. Daniel Wegner's research, for instance, questioned whether our sense of conscious will is a post hoc narrative, something we construct after the fact to make sense of actions that were already initiated by unconscious mechanisms. Neuroscience has added to this skepticism. Experiments by Benjamin Libet and others have shown that brain activity related to movement begins milliseconds before individuals report the conscious intention to act, suggesting that the brain decides before the person becomes aware of the decision. Despite these findings, many psychologists and philosophers resist the conclusion that free will is entirely illusory. Some argue for a more nuanced or compatibilist view, that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. According to this perspective, free will does not require absolute independence from causality, rather, it requires the ability to act according to one's own motives, values, and reasoning, even if those factors are themselves influenced by prior causes. This definition preserves a meaningful sense of agency while acknowledging that humans are not exempt from natural laws. Moreover, studies in social psychology show that belief in free will has real-world consequences. People who are primed to believe they have no free will tend to behave more selfishly, cheat more in experiments, and take less responsibility for their actions. Conversely, affirming belief in personal agency often correlates with greater motivation, self-control, and pro-social behavior. These findings suggest that the belief in free will, whether or not it is metaphysically accurate, can influence how people behave and how societies function. From a pragmatic standpoint, this means that denying free will entirely might carry psychological and social risks. At the same time, a rigid belief in total autonomy can be equally harmful. It can lead to blaming individuals for circumstances beyond their control, poverty, addiction, mental illness, while ignoring the systemic, biological, or environmental factors that shape those conditions. A balanced understanding requires recognizing both the limits of personal control and the real, if constrained, capacity people have to make choices, change behaviors, and reflect on their actions. In clinical psychology, this tension plays out in therapeutic approaches that encourage both accountability and compassion. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, helps clients identify and change maladaptive thought patterns, reinforcing the idea that they have the power to influence their behavior. Yet at the same time, it acknowledges how past trauma, social context, and emotional regulation affect one's ability to exercise that power. The therapeutic process itself often rests on the assumption that, while we may not choose the conditions we are born into, we can still choose how to respond to them. In conclusion, the role of free will in psychology remains a deeply contested issue, caught between empirical findings that suggest the limits of conscious control and philosophical commitments to moral responsibility and human dignity. The most thoughtful perspectives tend to avoid extremes, recognizing that while human behavior is influenced by countless factors beyond our awareness or control, there remains a meaningful space, however narrow, for choice, reflection, and intentionality. Whether or not we possess free will in the metaphysical sense, acting as though we do may be essential for living ethically, pursuing growth, and building societies that value both justice and compassion. The power of positive thinking. The power of positive thinking is a widely embraced yet controversial idea in psychology and popular culture. At its core, it suggests that maintaining an optimistic, affirming mindset can lead to improved mental health, better physical well-being, greater success in life, and even the ability to influence external circumstances. Promoted heavily in self-help literature, motivational speaking, and wellness circles, this concept has roots in both religious traditions and psychological theories, and has been popularized by books like Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thinking and, more recently, works such as The Secret. Supporters claim that positive thinking helps individuals overcome adversity, reduce stress, and achieve goals by harnessing the mind's potential. However, critics argue that this approach can be overly simplistic, dismissive of real suffering, and sometimes even psychologically harmful when misapplied. One of the key ideas behind positive thinking is that our thoughts influence our emotions, behavior, and outcomes. From a cognitive behavioral standpoint, this is partially supported. The way people interpret events can significantly affect their feelings and actions. For example, interpreting a setback as temporary and fixable, rather than permanent and personal, can foster resilience and problem-solving. Optimism has been associated with lower levels of depression, greater perseverance, stronger immune function, and even increased longevity. In this sense, cultivating positive thought patterns can genuinely enhance well-being and promote adaptive functioning. The practice of affirmations, visualizations, and goal setting is often used to activate this mindset. Some studies suggest that envisioning success or focusing on gratitude can increase motivation and improve performance. Positive emotions also tend to broaden one's sense of possibility, encouraging creative thinking and social connection. Psychologist Barbara Fredrickson's Broaden and Build theory of positive emotion supports the notion that positivity helps individuals build psychological resources over time, leading to greater resilience. However, the controversy emerges when positive thinking is taken to extremes or treated as a cure-all. One common criticism is that it can promote denial, self-blame, or emotional suppression. In the more commercialized or mystical versions of the idea, such as the law of attraction, positive thinking is framed not just as beneficial, but as a force that creates reality. This belief can lead people to assume that misfortune results from negative thinking, implicitly blaming victims of illness, poverty, or trauma for their own suffering. It may also discourage people from taking practical steps toward change, relying instead on visualization or affirmations alone. Moreover, there is a risk of toxic positivity, the pressure to maintain a cheerful outlook at all times, even in the face of loss, injustice, or legitimate emotional pain. When people feel forced to be positive, they may suppress negative emotions rather than process them, leading to emotional disconnection or increased psychological distress. In therapeutic settings, such avoidance can hinder healing rather than promote it. Some research has shown that overly optimistic expectations, when unmet, can lead to deeper disappointment or inaction, particularly if individuals are not realistically assessing risks and obstacles. The cultural context also plays a role in how positive thinking is perceived and applied. In many Western societies, especially the US, there is a strong emphasis on individual agency and self-determination, which aligns well with the ethos of positive thinking. But in other cultural contexts, where community, humility, or acceptance of fate may be more valued, the emphasis on relentlessly shaping one's own destiny through thought alone can seem naive or egocentric. Additionally, the pressure to be positive can become a tool of social control, used to silence dissent, dismiss systemic issues, or downplay the effects of structural inequality by insisting that all problems are solvable with the right mindset. In mental health care, most psychologists advocate for a balanced approach. While fostering hope and optimism can be powerful, it must be paired with emotional authenticity, critical thinking, and realistic coping strategies. Therapies such as acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, or dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, aim to integrate positive change with an acceptance of difficult emotions and life's inherent uncertainty. These approaches suggest that mental wellness is not about eliminating negative thoughts entirely but about learning to live meaningfully with both light and shadow. In conclusion, the power of positive thinking is a psychologically complex and culturally loaded idea. It has real merit in promoting resilience, improving mood, and shaping how we approach challenges. But when used without nuance, it can become a source of denial, blame, and emotional avoidance. The healthiest applications of positive thinking are those that acknowledge suffering, validate the full range of human emotion, and pair optimism with grounded action. In this way, positivity becomes a tool not for escaping reality, but for engaging with it more fully and constructively. Personality is fixed. The idea that personality is fixed, that the core traits that define who we are remain stable and unchangeable throughout life, is a long-standing and controversial proposition in psychology. On its face, this belief aligns with common intuition. People often feel they have a stable self that persists over time, and others around them may appear reliably consistent in how they think, feel, and behave. Traits like introversion or extroversion, conscientiousness, or emotional stability can seem deeply ingrained, leading to the impression that personality is set early in life and resists significant change. However, this perspective is both supported and challenged by a substantial body of psychological research, and its implications are far-reaching, touching on education, therapy, personal growth, and even criminal justice. Much of the foundation for the fixed personality view comes from trait theory, particularly the five-factor model, which identifies 5 broad dimensions of personality: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Numerous longitudinal studies have found that these traits exhibit a high degree of stability over time. For instance, someone who is highly conscientious in their 20s is likely to be similarly conscientious in their 50s. Twin studies also suggest that personality traits have a significant genetic component, indicating a biological basis that may impose limits on how much someone can change. From this standpoint, personality is like a psychological baseline. Individuals may fluctuate within a range, but the core traits remain fundamentally consistent. This stability has led some psychologists and philosophers to argue that personality is essentially fixed, at least after early adulthood. They contend that while people might adjust their behaviors in response to new roles or environments, their underlying disposition stays the same. This view is echoed in common sayings like, "A leopard doesn't change its spots," reflecting a cultural belief that people cannot fundamentally alter who they are. However, this fixed view of personality has been challenged by growing evidence that people can and do change over time, not only in behavior, but in the traits themselves. While personality traits are relatively stable, they are not immutable. Longitudinal research has shown that average personality traits shift across the lifespan in predictable ways. For example, people tend to become more conscientious, emotionally stable, and agreeable as they age, a pattern sometimes referred to as the maturity principle. These changes suggest that life experiences, responsibilities, and social roles, such as parenting, career development, or aging, can shape personality in meaningful ways. Furthermore, intentional change appears possible. Some studies have found that people who desire to change specific aspects of their personality, such as becoming more extrovert or less anxious, can, with effort and time, achieve measurable changes. Therapeutic interventions, especially those involving long-term cognitive behavioral or personality-targeted therapy, can lead to shifts in personality traits by addressing patterns of thought and behavior. For example, someone with high neuroticism who learns emotional regulation skills might over time exhibit lower levels of that trait. The debate over fixed versus changeable personality also raises deeper philosophical and ethical questions. If personality is largely fixed, then certain assumptions about responsibility, growth, and rehabilitation must be reconsidered. A fixed personality view could suggest limits to personal development or call into question the effectiveness of education and therapy in fostering change. In legal and social contexts, it might reinforce fatalistic attitudes about people's potential to reform, an issue particularly sensitive in discussions of criminal justice or mental health. On the other hand, acknowledging that personality can evolve supports a more hopeful and dynamic view of human nature. It encourages personal agency and lifelong development, affirming the capacity for change even in adulthood. Critics of the fixed personality model argue that believing personality cannot change may become a self-fulfilling prophecy, limiting effort and motivation to grow. They advocate for a more flexible, developmental understanding of personality, one that recognizes both genetic predispositions and the profound influence of environment, learning, and conscious intention. Ultimately, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Personality appears to have both stable and fluid components. While certain traits may be deeply rooted and difficult to transform completely, others may be more responsive to life events, reflection, and sustained effort. Rather than being either fixed or endlessly malleable, personality may be best understood as a system of tendencies that develop within the interplay of biology and experience, shaped, but not fully determined, by both. In conclusion, the idea that personality is fixed remains a provocative and complex claim. It is partially supported by evidence of trait stability and genetic influence, yet countered by findings that show meaningful change is possible across time and context. A balanced view accepts that while some aspects of who we are may remain relatively stable, humans retain the capacity to grow, adapt, and reshape themselves throughout life. The controversy continues not because the science is unclear, but because it strikes at the core of how we understand identity, potential, and the human capacity for transformation. The alpha male concept. The concept of the alpha male is a culturally popular but scientifically controversial idea rooted in the belief that within social groups, particularly among men, there exists a natural dominance hierarchy, with the most assertive, powerful, or successful individual occupying the top position. Often portrayed as confident, aggressive, sexually successful, and competitive, the so-called alpha male is thought to embody traits that supposedly make him a leader or the most desirable partner. This image has been promoted in everything from pop psychology and self-help literature to evolutionary theory and social media culture. However, closer examination reveals that the alpha male concept is based on oversimplified and often outdated interpretations of animal behavior and human psychology. The term alpha originally emerged from animal studies, particularly research on captive wolf packs in the mid-20th century. Observing that one wolf appeared to dominate others, researchers labeled it the alpha. This framework was later applied to other animals and even humans, influencing early sociobiological theories about mating and leadership. However, subsequent research revealed critical flaws in these early observations. In the wild, wolf packs typically consist of family units where the alpha is simply the parent, not a dominant stranger asserting control through aggression. The entire premise of the alpha hierarchy in wolves, one of the foundational models for the term, has since been largely debunked by the very scientists who first promoted it. Despite these corrections in the scientific literature, the idea of the alpha male persists in popular culture, especially in discussions around male behavior, dating, and social power. In many contemporary contexts, the term is used aspirationally, implying that men should aim to be dominant, emotionally stoic, and always in control. This ideal is often juxtaposed against the notion of the beta male, who is characterized as passive, weak, or subordinate. These binary labels are not only reductive but also unsupported by rigorous psychological evidence. In human societies, dominance and leadership are far more complex than the alpha model suggests. Psychological research shows that effective leadership and social influence often stem not from aggression or force but from traits like empathy, communication skills, and social intelligence. People tend to follow those they respect, not necessarily those who dominate. Furthermore, high-status individuals in human groups often rise not through intimidation but through cooperation and competence. In this sense, the traits associated with the stereotypical alpha, hostility, competitiveness, emotional repression, can be socially counterproductive or even maladaptive, especially in modern, egalitarian, and interdependent societies. The persistence of the alpha male idea also intersects with cultural norms and gender expectations. In societies that prize masculinity defined by toughness and control, the alpha label becomes a badge of honor. It can also serve as a way of policing male behavior, discouraging vulnerability or emotional openness in favor of dominance and aggression. This can lead to harmful psychological outcomes, reinforcing rigid gender roles and contributing to toxic masculinity, a pattern of behavior that pressures men to conform to unrealistic and often unhealthy ideals of strength and authority. In reality, human behavior is shaped by a wide array of factors, including personality, context, upbringing, and culture. Traits often associated with being an alpha, confidence, decisiveness, ambition, can be valuable, but so too can traits that are unfairly dismissed under this model, such as sensitivity, collaboration, or humility. Importantly, most people display a blend of these traits depending on the situation. Social roles and behaviors are fluid, not fixed into alpha and beta categories. Moreover, recent research in evolutionary psychology and anthropology has shown that cooperation, rather than dominance, was likely key to human survival. Early human groups thrived by working together, sharing resources, and nurturing relationships. These dynamics suggest that human social hierarchies are not hardwired around dominance but are flexible and shaped by cultural evolution and situational demands. In conclusion, the concept of the alpha male is a mythologized and oversimplified interpretation of human social behavior, rooted in misapplied animal research and sustained by cultural narratives rather than scientific accuracy. While certain traits associated with confidence and leadership may be socially rewarded in some contexts, the idea that men must embody a rigid, dominant alpha persona to be successful or respected is both psychologically limiting and empirically flawed. A more accurate understanding of human behavior recognizes the diversity of strengths individuals can bring to relationships, communities, and leadership roles, regardless of how well they fit a particular archetype. Attachment styles determine adult relationships. The idea that attachment styles developed in early childhood determine adult relationships is a foundational yet controversial concept in contemporary psychology. Rooted in attachment theory, originally proposed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, this theory suggests that the emotional bonds we form with our primary caregivers shape our expectations and behaviors in later romantic, social, and even professional relationships. According to this view, individuals carry internal working models, mental representations of self and others, that guide how they relate to intimacy, trust, conflict, and emotional closeness throughout life. While this perspective has profoundly influenced psychotherapy and relationship counseling, it has also faced significant criticism for its determinism, oversimplification, and limited cross-cultural applicability. Attachment theory classifies early attachment into several categories: secure, anxious, avoidant, and later, disorganized. Securely attached children typically experience consistent, responsive caregiving, leading them to view relationships as safe and themselves as worthy of love. Anxiously attached children may receive inconsistent attention and grow up fearing abandonment, often craving closeness but doubting their value. Avoidant children, whose caregivers are emotionally unavailable or rejecting, may learn to suppress emotional needs and become self-reliant to a fault. Disorganized attachment, often the result of trauma or abuse, involves a contradictory mix of approach and avoidance, leading to confusion and emotional turmoil in relationships. As these attachment styles are believed to carry into adulthood, they are thought to manifest in distinct relational patterns. Secure adults are generally comfortable with intimacy and autonomy, capable of healthy communication and emotional regulation. Anxious individuals may become preoccupied with their partners, constantly seeking reassurance and fearing rejection. Avoidant adults may keep emotional distance, struggle with vulnerability, and fear being overwhelmed by closeness. Disorganized adults may alternate between clinging and pushing away, often feeling torn between a desire for connection and fear of it. Supporters of this model argue that understanding one's attachment style can be transformative. It provides a language for self-awareness, emotional insight, and behavioral change. Therapists often use attachment-based frameworks to help clients recognize unconscious patterns that sabotage relationships or perpetuate cycles of insecurity and conflict. Empirical studies have found correlations between attachment style and relationship satisfaction, conflict resolution, emotional expression, and even physiological stress responses. From this perspective, early caregiving experiences can leave lasting emotional imprints that influence everything from jealousy and trust to sexual behavior and the ability to forgive. However, the idea that childhood attachment styles determine adult relationships is not without controversy. One major criticism is that it risks being overly deterministic, suggesting that early experiences lock people into fixed emotional patterns for life. In reality, human development is dynamic. People grow, adapt, and change in response to new relationships, therapy, trauma, and conscious effort. Many individuals with insecure attachment in childhood go on to form secure adult relationships, while some with secure beginnings encounter life events that destabilize them emotionally. The term earned security has emerged to describe those who shift toward more secure styles over time through reflection, healing, and positive relational experiences. Another critique involves the tendency to oversimplify complex human behavior into categories. Attachment styles are often presented in binary or categorical terms, but in practice, they exist on a continuum. Most people do not fit neatly into a single style, and their behavior may vary across different relationships and life stages. Moreover, cultural factors play a significant role in shaping attachment behaviors. What is considered secure or independent in one culture might be seen as avoidant or enmeshed in another, complicating the universal application of Western attachment models. Scientific concerns also arise around the methods used to assess adult attachment, which often rely on self-report questionnaires or interviews subject to bias, interpretation, and contextual influence. While the theory is supported by a considerable body of research, critics argue that its predictive power is modest and that other factors, such as personality traits, life events, mental health, and interpersonal skills, may have an equal or greater influence on adult relationships. Despite these limitations, the attachment framework remains a powerful psychological lens through which many people understand their relational lives. It emphasizes the emotional continuity of human experience, showing how patterns formed in vulnerability can persist into adulthood but also be brought into awareness and transformed. The controversy surrounding the theory reflects broader tensions in psychology between nature and nurture, between determinism and plasticity, and between simplification and complexity. Ultimately, while attachment styles may influence adult relationships, they do not dictate them. Human beings are not fixed by their past, they are shaped by it, but also capable of rewriting it. Criminal behavior has genetic roots. The idea that criminal behavior has genetic roots is one of the most controversial in psychology and criminology, as it touches on fundamental issues of personal responsibility, free will, morality, and social justice. At its core, this theory posits that certain individuals may be biologically predisposed to antisocial or criminal behavior due to inherited genetic factors. Proponents argue that just as genetic traits can influence intelligence, temperament, or susceptibility to disease, so too might they contribute to behaviors that violate legal or moral norms. However, the implications of such a claim are complex and deeply contested, especially when interpreted as deterministic or used to justify inequality or discrimination. Research into the genetic basis of criminality often begins with studies of heritability. Twin and adoption studies have shown that there is a moderate genetic influence on antisocial behavior. Identical twins, who share 100% of their genes, tend to be more similar in criminal behavior than fraternal twins, who share about 50%. Similarly, adopted children whose biological parents had histories of criminal behavior are more likely to engage in such behavior themselves, even when raised in non-criminal environments. These patterns suggest that genetics can play a role in predisposing individuals to traits associated with criminal conduct. However, genes do not code directly for criminal acts. There is no crime gene. Rather, genetics may influence underlying psychological traits that, under certain conditions, make criminal behavior more likely. For example, traits such as impulsivity, low empathy, sensation-seeking, and aggression have all been linked to increased risk of criminal or antisocial behavior. These traits can be partially heritable and may reflect differences in brain function or neurochemistry, such as imbalances in serotonin or dysfunction in the prefrontal cortex, a region associated with impulse control and decision-making. The role of genetic predisposition is further complicated by gene-environment interactions. A person with a genetic vulnerability may never engage in criminal behavior unless certain environmental conditions are also present. For example, a child born with a tendency toward impulsivity may only develop antisocial patterns if they grow up in a violent home, experience neglect, or are exposed to chronic stress. This interplay between biology and environment helps explain why most people with a genetic predisposition do not become criminals and why people without any obvious predisposition can still commit serious offenses under the right, or wrong, circumstances. One of the most cited examples of this interaction is research on the MAOA gene, sometimes sensationally referred to as the warrior gene. Some variants of this gene have been linked to increased aggression and risk of violent behavior, but primarily in individuals who experienced childhood abuse or neglect. This finding underscores the idea that genetic predispositions are not destiny, they influence probability, not certainty. The context in which a person is raised, parenting quality, socioeconomic status, peer influence, education, and exposure to trauma, can significantly moderate or exacerbate genetic risks. Despite the growing body of research, the idea that criminality has genetic roots remains highly controversial. Critics warn that focusing too much on biology risks reviving discredited ideas from the past, such as biological determinism or eugenics, which historically led to harmful policies like forced sterilization and the criminalization of certain racial or ethnic groups. There is also concern that genetic explanations may undermine personal responsibility or be used inappropriately in legal settings, as either excuses for criminal behavior or justifications for harsher control. Ethical questions arise as well. If someone is found to have a genetic predisposition to aggression or lawbreaking, should they be treated differently in court? Should society intervene earlier in the lives of at-risk children, and if so, how? These questions reveal the tension between understanding behavior scientifically and maintaining justice and fairness in social institutions. Importantly, most researchers today emphasize that genetic influences on criminal behavior are only part of a much larger picture. Criminality is not the product of biology alone, nor of environment alone, but of their complex and dynamic interaction. A responsible view acknowledges that biology may increase vulnerability but does not remove human agency or the importance of social and cultural context. Early intervention, education, therapy, and support systems can all play a powerful role in preventing crime, regardless of an individual's genetic makeup. In conclusion, the theory that criminal behavior has genetic roots is supported by evidence showing that inherited traits can influence predispositions toward antisocial conduct. However, genes are not destiny. Their influence is shaped by environment, experience, and choice. The controversy surrounding this idea stems less from the science itself and more from how it is interpreted and applied. Recognizing a biological component in behavior does not absolve individuals of responsibility, nor does it justify fatalism or discrimination. Instead, it calls for a more nuanced understanding of human behavior, one that respects both the biological and social forces at play and seeks solutions that are humane, evidence-based, and ethically sound. Empathy fatigue in helping professions. Empathy fatigue, also known as compassion fatigue, is a psychological phenomenon that affects individuals in helping professions such as healthcare, social work, psychotherapy, emergency response, and humanitarian aid. It refers to the emotional exhaustion and reduced capacity to empathize that can result from prolonged exposure to others' suffering. Although the desire to help and care for others is central to these professions, the constant demand for emotional engagement can, over time, become overwhelming. As a result, those who entered their fields with a deep sense of compassion may begin to feel numb, detached, or even cynical about the very people they are trying to help. This erosion of empathy is not only personally distressing but also raises difficult ethical questions about responsibility, boundaries, and sustainability in caregiving roles. Empathy fatigue is often misunderstood as a form of burnout, and while the two are related, they are distinct. Burnout typically stems from systemic pressures such as overwork, lack of resources, or bureaucratic dysfunction. Empathy fatigue, on the other hand, arises more directly from the emotional toll of caring for people who are in pain, traumatized, or dying. It can be triggered by repeated exposure to traumatic stories, chronic suffering, or a sense of helplessness in the face of human need. For example, a nurse working in a pediatric oncology ward may feel crushed by the ongoing grief of families, or a social worker supporting abuse victims may struggle with intrusive thoughts and emotional withdrawal after hearing one story too many. One of the controversial aspects of empathy fatigue is the moral dilemma it creates. In many helping professions, empathy is not just a personal virtue, it is an expected and even required part of the job. Professionals are often trained and encouraged to put themselves in others' shoes, to remain emotionally available, and to show unconditional support. But this emotional openness, when not balanced with boundaries and self-care, can become unsustainable. Critics argue that institutional cultures which demand constant empathy without acknowledging its psychological cost are setting professionals up for failure. Others go further, suggesting that the glorification of empathy in these roles can lead to guilt or shame when individuals inevitably reach their emotional limits. Another layer of controversy surrounds the potential consequences of empathy fatigue for service quality and ethical practice. When a caregiver becomes emotionally depleted, they may begin to withdraw, avoid patient contact, or respond with indifference. This can erode trust, reduce the effectiveness of care, and ultimately harm those who are most vulnerable. In some cases, empathy fatigue can escalate into secondary traumatic stress, where the caregiver begins to exhibit symptoms similar to those of post-traumatic stress disorder, such as hypervigilance, nightmares, or emotional numbing, due to their repeated exposure to others' trauma. At the same time, there is growing recognition that empathy fatigue is not a personal weakness, but a predictable human response to overwhelming emotional labor. It reflects the limits of our psychological capacity to absorb and respond to suffering. Efforts to address the problem have shifted toward building resilience and promoting what is known as compassion satisfaction, the fulfillment and purpose that come from helping others. Strategies such as peer support, trauma-informed supervision, mindfulness practices, workload management, and training in emotional boundaries are increasingly seen as essential tools for sustaining empathy over the long term. Some researchers and clinicians have also advocated for a rethinking of empathy itself. Instead of encouraging unfiltered emotional identification with clients or patients, they argue for a model based on cognitive empathy, understanding others' experiences without fully absorbing their emotional pain. This approach allows professionals to remain attuned and responsive without becoming overwhelmed. It also aligns with findings in neuroscience and psychology that suggest empathy, when unregulated, can lead to distress and personal suffering, while compassion, a more action-oriented form of concern, tends to promote resilience and well-being. In conclusion, empathy fatigue in helping professions highlights a fundamental tension between the human need to connect with others and the emotional limits of that connection. While empathy is central to care and healing, it can also become a source of harm if not managed properly. Recognizing and addressing empathy fatigue is not about discouraging care or lowering standards, it is about protecting the emotional health of those who are expected to support others. As awareness of the issue grows, so too does the movement toward institutional cultures that value sustainable compassion, emotional balance, and realistic expectations of what it means to help. Ultimately, caring for the caregivers is not only a moral imperative but a practical necessity if we hope to preserve empathy where it matters most. Intelligence is heritable. The idea that intelligence is heritable, that a significant portion of an individual's cognitive ability is determined by their genetic makeup, has long been a subject of scientific inquiry and social controversy. At its most basic, this proposition suggests that the differences we observe in intelligence among people are, to a meaningful degree, the result of inherited traits passed down from parents to children. While this view has substantial support from behavioral genetics and psychology, it raises complex and often sensitive questions about human potential, equality, education, and social policy. Scientific research into the heritability of intelligence typically relies on twin studies, adoption studies, and, more recently, genome-wide association studies, GWAS. Identical twins reared apart, for instance, tend to have highly correlated IQ scores, often more so than fraternal twins or adopted siblings raised in the same household. These findings suggest that genetic similarity predicts similarity in cognitive ability. Heritability estimates of intelligence in adulthood often range between 50% and 80%, meaning that over half of the variation in IQ scores within a given population can be statistically attributed to genetic differences. However, heritability does not imply immutability. One of the most common misconceptions is that if intelligence is heritable, it cannot be changed. In reality, heritability is a population-level statistic that varies depending on the environment. In highly uniform environments, where access to education, nutrition, and healthcare is relatively equal, genetic differences tend to account for a larger portion of individual variation in intelligence. In contrast, in environments marked by inequality and deprivation, environmental factors play a much larger role in shaping outcomes. For example, a child born with high genetic potential for intelligence may not reach that potential if raised in poverty or without adequate educational support. Moreover, intelligence is not governed by a single intelligence gene. Instead, it is polygenic, meaning it is influenced by a large number of genes, each contributing a small effect. Environmental factors such as early childhood stimulation, parental involvement, exposure to language, schooling quality, nutrition, and even emotional security interact with these genetic predispositions in complex ways. Gene-environment interactions can either amplify or suppress cognitive development, and recent research in epigenetics has shown that environmental conditions can affect how genes related to cognition are expressed. This nuanced understanding of intelligence and heritability is often overshadowed by controversy, in part because of how such ideas have been misused historically. In the early 20th century, theories of heritable intelligence were used to justify eugenics, forced sterilization, and racial discrimination. Even today, discussions about intelligence and genetics can evoke fears of determinism, inequality, or ideological bias. Critics worry that emphasizing heredity in discussions of intelligence may reinforce stereotypes or suggest that social disparities are biologically predetermined, rather than rooted in historical and structural inequality. Proponents of the heritability model argue that acknowledging genetic influences on intelligence does not negate the importance of education, equity, or personal effort. Rather, understanding the biological components of intelligence can inform more individualized approaches to teaching and learning. It also helps explain why people differ in cognitive abilities even when raised in similar environments. Furthermore, recognizing the heritable aspects of intelligence does not mean ignoring the powerful role that environment plays in shaping outcomes. For example, interventions such as early childhood education, parental training, and school reform can yield significant gains, particularly in disadvantaged populations. Contemporary psychology tends to reject both genetic determinism and environmental reductionism. Instead, it embraces an interactionist model, in which genes set certain potentials or boundaries, while the environment determines how those potentials are expressed. Intelligence, in this view, is a dynamic trait, partly inherited, partly cultivated, and always subject to change over time through experience, effort, and opportunity. In conclusion, the assertion that intelligence is heritable reflects a well-supported, though complex, scientific reality. Genetic factors play a significant role in shaping cognitive ability, but they do not act in isolation. The interplay between nature and nurture is essential to understanding intelligence, and focusing on either factor alone provides an incomplete and potentially misleading picture. While acknowledging heritability can help deepen our understanding of human development, it must be paired with a commitment to equity, opportunity, and the recognition that every individual, regardless of genetic background, has the capacity for growth and achievement. The blank slate. The concept of the blank slate refers to the idea that the human mind starts as a clean slate at birth, void of innate traits or predispositions, and that all knowledge, behavior, and personality arise solely from experience and learning. This notion, closely associated with philosophers like John Locke in the 17th century, became a central tenet of Enlightenment thinking and later influenced various schools of psychology and social theory, especially during the 20th century. According to this view, humans are largely or entirely shaped by their environments, with culture, upbringing, and personal experiences determining the full range of individual differences. This idea gained considerable traction in the social sciences, particularly during a time when researchers sought to challenge the biological determinism that underpinned many discriminatory ideologies, including racism, sexism, and eugenics. The blank slate framework offered a powerful tool for arguing that all people have equal potential and that social inequalities are the result of external factors rather than innate differences. It formed the basis for behaviorist psychology, which maintained that behavior could be shaped and controlled through conditioning, and it aligned with Marxist and egalitarian political philosophies that emphasized the role of institutions and social structures in shaping human behavior. However, the blank slate theory has become increasingly controversial, especially as research in genetics, neuroscience, and evolutionary psychology has revealed substantial evidence for innate aspects of human nature. Studies have shown that many traits, such as temperament, intelligence, and even political preferences, have a heritable component. Twin studies, for example, consistently find that identical twins raised apart often show remarkable similarities in behavior and personality, suggesting that biology plays a more significant role than the blank slate hypothesis would allow. Likewise, evolutionary psychology has emphasized the idea that certain cognitive structures and behavioral tendencies are products of natural selection, shared across all humans regardless of culture. Critics of the blank slate argue that denying the role of biology in human nature leads to an overly simplistic and often unrealistic view of human development. It suggests, for instance, that children can be molded into anything if only the environment is properly controlled, ignoring the fact that people respond differently to similar experiences due to innate differences. These critics also point out that a rigid commitment to environmental explanations can backfire, making social reform efforts less effective by overlooking the real psychological and biological diversity among individuals. One of the most influential modern critiques of the blank slate is found in the work of cognitive scientist Steven Pinker, who argued that the denial of human nature has hindered progress in understanding both individual behavior and broader social phenomena. In his book The Blank Slate, The Modern Denial of Human Nature, Pinker contends that acknowledging innate tendencies does not necessarily justify inequality or discrimination, but rather equips us with a more accurate understanding of ourselves. He warns that suppressing scientific findings out of fear of their political misuse can be counterproductive, and that a nuanced view, one that integrates both nature and nurture, is essential for informed policy and ethical reasoning. Nevertheless, defenders of environmentalist perspectives caution against overemphasizing biological explanations, especially given the history of how such ideas have been used to rationalize social hierarchies and oppression. They argue that even when traits have genetic influences, their expression is profoundly shaped by context, and that societal change remains possible and necessary. Moreover, the fear is not just about misinterpretation, but about how certain narratives can reinforce fatalism or justify the status quo. Ultimately, the blank slate debate underscores a deeper philosophical divide about what it means to be human. Are we primarily shaped by culture and experience? Or are we guided by evolved psychological mechanisms and genetic predispositions? Most contemporary psychologists now adopt a more integrative stance, recognizing that both biology and environment are inseparable in shaping human development. Rather than seeing nature and nurture as opposing forces, the prevailing view is that they are deeply intertwined, with each influencing the other throughout life. In this sense, the blank slate is no longer accepted as a literal truth, but its legacy continues to influence discussions about education, parenting, criminal justice, and equality. The challenge remains to build a society that respects both the biological realities of human nature and the transformative power of cultural and social environments, while avoiding the ideological extremes that deny one side or the other. The effectiveness of antidepressants. The effectiveness of antidepressants remains one of the most debated issues in modern psychology and psychiatry. These medications, particularly selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, SNRIs, are widely prescribed to treat major depressive disorder and related mood conditions. While millions of people report relief from symptoms and improved quality of life, critics argue that the benefits are often overstated, the underlying mechanisms poorly understood, and the risks underappreciated. This ongoing debate reflects the complexity of both depression itself and the human brain. Supporters of antidepressant treatment point to a vast body of clinical research showing that these medications can significantly reduce depressive symptoms, especially in cases of moderate to severe depression. Randomized controlled trials, meta-analyses, and real-world clinical experience have repeatedly demonstrated that antidepressants are more effective than placebo for many individuals. These medications can help rebalance neurotransmitters such as serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, which are believed to be involved in mood regulation. For people suffering from deep despair, lack of motivation, or suicidal ideation, antidepressants can provide a critical window of stabilization, making psychotherapy more accessible or tolerable. However, not all evidence paints such a clear picture. A number of studies have found that the difference in symptom relief between antidepressants and placebos can be surprisingly small, particularly in mild or moderate depression. Critics argue that much of the early research was influenced by publication bias, where studies showing strong positive effects were more likely to be published than those with null or negative results. This has led some to claim that the chemical imbalance theory, long used to justify the use of antidepressants, is overly simplistic or even misleading. Depression is now understood to be a multifactorial condition involving genetics, trauma, cognition, environment, and more, factors that medication alone may not adequately address. Another layer of complexity lies in the individual variability in response. Some people respond remarkably well to a particular antidepressant, while others experience no benefit or suffer from unwanted side effects such as weight gain, emotional numbness, sexual dysfunction, or insomnia. Withdrawal symptoms, sometimes referred to as discontinuation syndrome, can also be significant, especially when medications are stopped abruptly. This variability raises important questions about overprescription and the adequacy of current diagnostic and treatment practices. There is also concern about the long-term use of antidepressants. While they are generally considered safe, relatively few studies have examined their effects over many years. Some experts worry about the potential for physiological dependency or changes in brain chemistry that make it difficult to function without medication. Others point to the social and economic implications of widespread pharmacological treatment, suggesting that antidepressants may be used to manage symptoms in a way that ignores deeper systemic issues such as loneliness, poverty, or workplace stress. Despite these concerns, it is important not to dismiss antidepressants outright. For many people, they offer genuine relief and can be a life-saving intervention. The key lies in treating depression as a complex, individualized condition. Antidepressants can be most effective when used as part of a broader treatment strategy that includes psychotherapy, lifestyle changes, social support, and, when necessary, medical care for comorbid conditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, exercise, and mindfulness-based interventions have all shown evidence of effectiveness, and their integration with pharmacological treatment often leads to better outcomes than either approach alone. Ultimately, the question of antidepressant effectiveness does not have a simple yes or no answer. These medications are neither miracle cures nor ineffective placebos. They are tools, sometimes powerful, sometimes blunt, whose value depends heavily on the context in which they are used, the accuracy of the diagnosis, and the goals of the patient. As research evolves and understanding deepens, a more personalized and balanced approach to depression treatment may offer the best path forward, one that respects both the promise and the limitations of antidepressant medications. The power pose. The idea of the power pose suggests that adopting expansive, open body postures, such as standing tall with hands on hips or arms stretched wide, can significantly influence one's internal state by increasing confidence, reducing stress, and enhancing performance. Popularized by social psychologist Amy Cuddy in a widely viewed TED Talk and based on a 2010 study, this concept became a cultural sensation, often promoted as a simple life hack to fake it till you become it. According to the original research, just 2 minutes of holding a high power pose was said to boost testosterone, linked to dominance, lower cortisol, linked to stress, and increase risk-taking behavior and feelings of personal power. The idea was compelling: by changing your posture, you could change your mind. However, the power pose theory soon became one of the most controversial and scrutinized topics in psychology. Initial enthusiasm was dampened by the replication crisis, a broader movement within psychology where many well-known findings failed to hold up under repeated testing. In 2015, multiple independent research teams attempted to replicate the original power pose findings and found that the physiological effects, such as changes in hormone levels, were not consistently observed. While some studies did find that posture could influence subjective feelings of confidence, the more dramatic claims about hormones and behavior change could not be reliably reproduced. This inconsistency sparked significant debate about scientific rigor, research methodology, and the media's role in popularizing unproven psychological findings. Critics argued that the original study had a small sample size and potentially inflated results due to publication bias and selective reporting. Others pointed out that the cultural appetite for quick, empowering solutions may have driven public acceptance more than empirical validation. The controversy led to discussions about the ethical responsibility of scientists and communicators to ensure that compelling narratives are grounded in solid evidence. Amy Cuddy herself later clarified her position, acknowledging the limitations of the original research while defending the broader idea that posture can influence self-perception. She and others argued that while hormonal claims might be overstated, there is still value in exploring how body language shapes internal psychological experiences. Indeed, some follow-up studies have shown that expansive postures may affect how people feel, speak, or carry themselves in certain social or performance contexts, even if the underlying biological mechanisms remain unclear or inconsistent. One of the less controversial aspects of the power pose idea is the broader principle that mind and body are interconnected. Embodied cognition, the idea that bodily states influence cognitive and emotional processes, is supported by a range of psychological research. How we hold ourselves can affect how we're perceived by others, and in turn, how we perceive ourselves. Standing or sitting with openness, for example, may encourage more assertive thinking or behavior, even if not through hormonal shifts. Nevertheless, the controversy surrounding the power pose has served as a cautionary tale in the field of psychology. It underscores the importance of replication, transparency, and skepticism, especially when bold claims enter public discourse. The idea that a simple change in posture can transform your confidence and career is attractive, but the evidence supporting such claims must be strong, consistent, and reproducible. In the end, while the power pose may not be the revolutionary tool it was once believed to be, the core insight it points toward, that posture, presence, and self-awareness matter, is not without merit. Even if its most dramatic claims have not stood up to scientific scrutiny, it invites a valuable conversation about the subtle, often overlooked ways in which our physical selves shape our mental experiences. Gender identity and socialization. Gender identity and socialization represent a complex and often contentious area in psychology, sociology, and cultural studies, centering on how individuals come to understand themselves as male, female, both, neither, or somewhere along a broader gender spectrum, and how society influences that understanding. Gender identity refers to a person's internal sense of their own gender, which may or may not align with the sex they were assigned at birth. Socialization, in this context, refers to the lifelong process through which individuals learn the norms, behaviors, and expectations associated with their society's conception of gender. From early childhood, individuals are exposed to a vast array of social cues and cultural scripts about what it means to be a boy or a girl. These cues come from parents, peers, teachers, media, religion, and broader cultural institutions. Children are often treated differently based on their perceived gender from birth. Boys may be encouraged to be assertive, active, or stoic, while girls might be rewarded for being nurturing, gentle, or emotionally expressive. Even toys, clothing, and language reflect and reinforce gendered expectations, shaping a child's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. This process of gender socialization has long been a subject of psychological inquiry, particularly as it intersects with theories of development and identity formation. Behaviorist and social learning theories emphasize the role of reinforcement, imitation, and modeling. Children learn gender-appropriate behavior by observing others and being rewarded for conforming to norms. Cognitive developmental theories, such as those proposed by Lawrence Kohlberg and others, suggest that as children mature, they develop increasingly sophisticated understandings of gender roles, beginning with simple recognition of gender categories and evolving into a stable sense of gender identity. However, the relationship between socialization and gender identity is far from straightforward. In recent decades, research has increasingly recognized that gender identity is not solely a product of environmental input, but also reflects internal, possibly biological, predispositions. Studies on transgender individuals, whose gender identity does not align with their assigned sex, highlight the limitations of viewing gender as entirely socially constructed. Many transgender people report a deep and consistent sense of gender from an early age, often despite strong socialization pressures to conform to the gender roles associated with their birth sex. This has led to greater recognition of the role that innate or neurobiological factors may play in shaping gender identity, though the precise mechanisms remain a subject of ongoing study and debate. The controversy intensifies around the extent to which gender roles are natural or socially constructed. Some argue that there are biological underpinnings to many observed differences in behavior between men and women, such as tendencies toward aggression, nurturing, or spatial reasoning, based on hormonal influences, brain structure, and evolutionary psychology. Others contend that these differences are often exaggerated or misinterpreted, and that what we perceive as natural is in fact deeply shaped by cultural assumptions and social conditioning. Feminist theorists, for example, have long critiqued the ways in which gender roles have been used to justify inequality, arguing that gender is largely a performance, something learned, enacted, and reinforced through repeated social interaction. The tension between biology and socialization becomes especially pronounced in debates over gender diversity and non-binary identities. Traditional models that see gender as a binary, male or female, are being increasingly challenged by the recognition that many individuals experience their gender outside of these categories. Non-binary, gender-fluid, and agender people assert that rigid social expectations often fail to capture the complexity of their identities. Critics of this view sometimes argue that expanding gender categories undermines social cohesion or reflects a kind of cultural relativism detached from biological realities. Supporters, on the other hand, see it as a necessary evolution of human rights and psychological understanding, one that affirms individual autonomy and the diversity of human experience. Gender identity and socialization are also political issues, particularly when it comes to education, healthcare, and legal recognition. Debates over how gender is taught in schools, access to gender-affirming medical care, and the rights of transgender people to use public facilities according to their gender identity reflect deep cultural divisions. These discussions often reveal broader anxieties about the role of tradition, authority, and individual freedom in a rapidly changing world. Psychologically, most contemporary researchers agree that gender identity emerges through a dynamic interaction between biological factors and socialization processes. It is neither wholly innate nor entirely learned, but rather develops through the interplay of internal dispositions and external influences over time. This perspective encourages a move away from rigid categorizations and toward a more nuanced, empathetic understanding of gender as something that is deeply personal, contextually shaped, and deserving of respect and recognition. In conclusion, gender identity and socialization remain central topics in understanding human development, touching on questions of biology, culture, morality, and politics. The controversy stems not only from scientific uncertainties but also from broader cultural disagreements about identity, tradition, and change. Yet within this complexity lies an opportunity for psychology to contribute to a more inclusive and compassionate understanding of how people come to know themselves, and each other. Narcissism is on the rise. The claim that narcissism is on the rise has sparked widespread debate among psychologists, educators, and social commentators, raising difficult questions about cultural values, generational change, and how we define psychological health. At the core of this idea is the assertion that traits associated with narcissism, such as grandiosity, entitlement, self-absorption, and an inflated sense of one's own importance, are becoming more prevalent, particularly in younger generations. Some researchers argue that shifts in parenting styles, educational practices, and the rise of social media have fostered a cultural environment that promotes excessive self-focus at the expense of empathy, humility, and community. Others, however, challenge the validity of these claims, arguing that the evidence is mixed, that narcissism may be misunderstood or misdiagnosed, and that concerns about its rise may reflect moral panic rather than measurable psychological change. The narrative that narcissism is increasing gained traction in the early 2000s, when several studies using the Narcissistic Personality Inventory (NPI) suggested that college students in the United States were scoring higher on narcissistic traits than earlier generations. Psychologists like Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell became prominent voices in this discussion, arguing in their book The Narcissism Epidemic that Western culture, especially in the United States, had increasingly promoted values of individualism, self-esteem, and personal branding to a degree that encouraged narcissistic attitudes. They pointed to trends such as the proliferation of reality television, the self-esteem movement in education, and the normalization of self-promotion on platforms like Facebook and Instagram as evidence of a culture growing more obsessed with self-image and recognition. Supporters of this view argue that children raised to believe they are special and deserving of praise regardless of effort may struggle to develop realistic self-concepts. Participation trophies, constant praise, and overprotective parenting may unintentionally cultivate entitlement and fragility. In adulthood, this may manifest as an excessive need for admiration, difficulty handling criticism, or a lack of empathy, hallmark traits of narcissistic personality tendencies. Moreover, digital culture amplifies these tendencies. Social media platforms reward curated self-presentation and public validation, creating a psychological feedback loop that reinforces self-absorption and external validation as measures of worth. However, critics of the "narcissism is rising" argument caution against overgeneralization and methodological flaws. Some researchers have questioned the reliability and cultural sensitivity of the NPI, arguing that it may conflate confidence or assertiveness with pathological narcissism. Others note that rising NPI scores could reflect greater comfort with self-expression or a decrease in social inhibition, rather than an actual increase in narcissistic personality traits. There is also disagreement over whether generational differences are meaningful or simply reflect normal developmental changes. Young adults have always tended to score higher on self-focused traits than older adults, who typically grow more community-oriented with age. Furthermore, some psychologists argue that concern about rising narcissism may reflect broader anxieties about societal change rather than objective evidence. Every generation tends to look at the one that follows with suspicion, often interpreting new behaviors or values as signs of moral decline. In this light, the worry about increased narcissism may be a projection of discomfort with cultural shifts toward diversity, self-assertion, and digital modes of identity. From this perspective, what is framed as narcissism may sometimes be a misreading of empowerment, self-advocacy, or cultural changes in how people express themselves. It's also worth noting that true narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, a clinical condition characterized by deep patterns of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy, remains relatively rare. While subclinical narcissistic traits may fluctuate with culture. Diagnosing an epidemic of narcissism risks pathologizing behaviors that may fall within the range of normal personality variation. There is also a danger in using the label narcissist as a catch-all insult, diluting its meaning and potentially undermining efforts to understand and treat genuine cases. In conclusion, the idea that narcissism is on the rise captures a cultural unease about self-focus, entitlement, and changing social norms. While there is some evidence of increases in narcissistic traits among younger people in specific contexts, the findings are far from conclusive, and the interpretation of this data remains hotly contested. What is clear is that societal shifts, toward individualism, digital self-presentation, and new parenting styles, are reshaping how people understand and express themselves. Whether these shifts reflect growing narcissism or simply evolving norms is still an open question. What matters, perhaps more than measuring narcissism itself, is fostering a cultural balance, one that supports healthy self-esteem while still emphasizing empathy, accountability, and connection to others. Narcissistic abuse. Narcissistic abuse is a psychological concept that refers to a pattern of manipulative, controlling, and emotionally harmful behavior carried out by someone with narcissistic traits or a narcissistic personality disorder. Though not officially recognized as a distinct clinical diagnosis, narcissistic abuse has gained increasing attention in psychological and therapeutic communities due to its damaging effects on victims' self-esteem, identity, and mental health. The term is controversial in part because it walks a fine line between labeling harmful relational dynamics and pathologizing certain personalities, raising questions about overuse, misapplication, and the stigmatization of narcissism itself. At the core of narcissistic abuse is a relational dynamic in which one person, typically exhibiting traits such as grandiosity, entitlement, lack of empathy, and a need for admiration, seeks to dominate and control another, often more empathetic and accommodating, individual. This form of abuse is not always overt, it frequently manifests through subtle, psychological tactics such as gaslighting, emotional invalidation, blame shifting, intermittent reinforcement, silent treatment, and love bombing followed by devaluation. These behaviors gradually erode the victim's sense of reality, personal agency, and self-worth. Gaslighting, in particular, is a hallmark of narcissistic abuse. It involves manipulating someone into doubting their perceptions, memories, or sanity, often by denying or distorting facts in ways that make the victim question their own judgment. Over time, this creates a psychological dependency on the abuser for truth, increasing the abuser's power and control. Victims may come to believe that they are overly sensitive, irrational, or even mentally unstable, when in fact they are reacting to persistent emotional invalidation. Another common pattern involves the idealization-devaluation-discard cycle. Initially, the narcissistic individual may shower the victim with attention, flattery, and affection, creating an intense bond known as love bombing. This idealization phase draws the victim in, often making them feel uniquely valued or even adored. However, once the narcissistic individual feels secure in the relationship or perceives a threat to their control, the devaluation phase begins. The same person who once offered praise may now deliver criticism, coldness, or contempt. Finally, the discard phase occurs when the narcissist abruptly detaches, often leaving the victim confused, devastated, and craving closure. The psychological toll of narcissistic abuse can be profound. Victims may experience anxiety, depression, chronic self-doubt, emotional numbness, complex PTSD, and a diminished sense of identity. Recovery is often complicated by the fact that narcissistic abuse does not always leave visible marks. Because the behavior is subtle and insidious, outsiders, including friends, family, or even therapists, may underestimate or misinterpret the victim's distress. This can compound the sense of isolation and confusion, reinforcing the effects of the abuse. One source of controversy around the concept lies in its broad usage, particularly in popular culture and social media. The term narcissist is sometimes used casually to describe any difficult or self-centered person, diluting its clinical meaning and leading to misunderstandings. Some critics argue that the label of narcissistic abuse is occasionally weaponized in interpersonal conflicts, creating a one-sided narrative that overlooks mutual dysfunction. Moreover, it risks reinforcing a simplistic victim-abuser dichotomy, when in reality many abusive dynamics involve complex interplay between unresolved trauma, attachment issues, and communication breakdowns on both sides. Nevertheless, for many survivors, the framework of narcissistic abuse provides a powerful tool for making sense of confusing or traumatizing relationships. It offers language to describe experiences that were previously hard to articulate and validates the emotional impact of psychological manipulation. Therapeutic interventions such as trauma-informed therapy, boundary-setting skills, and self-compassion practices are often essential in helping individuals regain their sense of self and rebuild trust in their own perceptions. In the end, narcissistic abuse is a controversial but deeply meaningful psychological idea. It shines a light on the ways emotional power can be misused in close relationships and emphasizes the importance of empathy, authenticity, and psychological safety. While the concept requires careful, nuanced application, its recognition has been life-changing for many who lived for years in the shadow of subtle, invisible harm. Nature versus nurture. The nature versus nurture debate is one of the most fundamental and enduring controversies in psychology, exploring the relative influence of genetic inheritance, nature, and environmental factors, nurture, on human development. At its heart, the debate seeks to answer a deceptively simple question: are we who we are because of our biology, or because of our experiences? While the question is ancient, traced back to philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, it remains relevant in contemporary discussions about intelligence, personality, mental illness, behavior, and identity. The nature side of the debate argues that our traits are primarily determined by biology. This includes genetic factors inherited from our parents as well as broader evolutionary influences that have shaped the human species over millennia. Supporters of this view often point to twin studies, particularly those involving identical twins raised apart, which reveal striking similarities in personality, intelligence, and even interests, despite different environments. Behavioral genetics, neuroscience, and evolutionary psychology all provide frameworks for understanding how genes contribute to behavior, suggesting that many aspects of who we are, our temperament, cognitive abilities, susceptibility to mental illness, have strong hereditary components. On the other hand, the nurture perspective emphasizes the role of environment in shaping human behavior and development. From the moment of birth, and even before, in the womb, individuals are shaped by their social context, culture, parenting, education, peer interactions, and life experiences. Early childhood development research shows how profoundly children are affected by their upbringing, with factors like attachment, trauma, and socioeconomic status influencing emotional health and cognitive growth. Nurture-based theories gained significant traction during the 20th century with the rise of behaviorism, which argued that behavior is the result of learning through conditioning and reinforcement rather than innate tendencies. What makes this debate controversial is not just the scientific complexity, but the social and political implications attached to it. Emphasizing nature can lead to deterministic views, where individual differences in intelligence, personality, or behavior are seen as unchangeable, potentially justifying inequality or discrimination. For instance, if criminal behavior is believed to be genetically determined, it might reduce personal responsibility or limit efforts at rehabilitation. Conversely, emphasizing nurture may encourage efforts to improve social conditions and education but can also overlook the biological constraints that influence learning and development. Both extremes carry ethical and practical risks when taken too far. Modern psychological science has largely moved beyond the binary framing of nature versus nurture, recognizing that both play inseparable and interacting roles in development. Genes provide a blueprint, but the environment can shape how, when, and whether those genetic tendencies are expressed, a concept known as gene-environment interaction. For example, a child might inherit a genetic predisposition for high intelligence, but whether that potential is realized depends on access to education, nutrition, emotional support, and other environmental conditions. Likewise, stress or trauma can trigger the onset of mental health disorders in individuals who have a genetic vulnerability, showing how deeply entangled biology and experience can be. Another layer of complexity is added by epigenetics, a field that studies how environmental factors can affect gene expression without altering the genetic code itself. Stress, diet, exposure to toxins, or nurturing behavior can switch on or off certain genes, meaning that even biological predispositions are not fixed. This dynamic view helps bridge the gap between nature and nurture, illustrating how the environment can literally shape biology, sometimes in ways that are heritable across generations. In practice, the implications of this debate influence nearly every area of psychology, from clinical treatment to educational strategies. Understanding the roots of behavior helps psychologists design more effective interventions, whether it's treating mental illness, supporting child development, or addressing addiction. For example, a balanced approach to treating depression might include both medication, addressing biological components, and therapy, addressing learned behaviors and emotional experiences. Recognizing the interplay of nature and nurture promotes more holistic and individualized approaches to care. In conclusion, the nature versus nurture debate is not a question of either-or, but of how biology and environment work together to shape the human experience. While both sides offer valuable insights, neither is sufficient alone to explain the full complexity of human behavior. The most accurate understanding lies in appreciating their interaction, how genetic predisposition sets certain potentials and boundaries, while the environment molds, amplifies, or suppresses them over time. This integrated perspective affirms that while we may not be entirely free to become anything, we are not prisoners of our biology either. Human development is a dynamic, unfolding process, guided by the intricate dance between what we inherit and what we experience.